I never expected you to become part of my internal landscape, not because you forced your way into it, not because you demanded space, but because people usually remain external. They exist around me, near me, sometimes even close to me, but never within the architecture of how I think. That space has always belonged to me alone, carefully maintained, carefully protected, carefully structured. I've spent years building it that way, not out of fear, not because I distrust people, but because most people move through life looking for reflections of themselves. They don't truly see what's in front of them. They see what they expect to find. And once they decide who you are, they stop paying attention. They stop observing. They stop listening. They stop recognizing the difference between the person they imagined and the person standing right in front of them. I've watched it happen more times than I can count. People become comfortable with assumptions, comfortable with incomplete understanding, comfortable with certainty they never earned. I learned how to exist in ways that left room between myself and everyone else, enough room to breathe, enough room to remain untouched, enough room to keep the parts of me that matter from becoming distorted by careless interpretation. For a long time, it worked better than I expected. People came and went. Conversations happened. Conchings formed. Life moved forward. And through all of it, something essential remained unchanged. Me, or at least, that's what I thought. Then you arrived. And nothing dramatic happened. That's the strange part. There wasn't a defining moment. No sudden realization. No instant recognition. No cinematic shift where everything became obvious all at once. It happened gradually, quietly, almost invisibly, like the tide changing direction beneath the surface while everything above it still appears calm. At first, I only noticed small things. The way you listened, the way you paused before responding, the way you seemed more interested in understanding than reacting. Most people hear words. You seem to hear intention. Most people respond to what is said. You responded to what was meant. That difference is subtle, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. I remember realizing that conversations with you felt different. Not easier, not harder, just more accurate, as though some invisible layer usually present between people wasn't there, as though meaning traveled directly from one mind to another without losing itself in translation. That shouldn't have stood out as much as it did. And yet it did, because accuracy is rare, much rarer than affection, much rarer than attraction, much rarer than compatibility. People talk endlessly about chemistry, about connection, about emotional closeness, but they rarely talk about recognition, true recognition, the experience of being understood without being reduced, seen without being simplified, known without being rewritten. That's different. And that's what I found myself encountering with you. Not occasionally, consistently. The consistency is what made it impossible to dismiss. Anyone can understand you once. Anyone can accidentally say the right thing. Anyone can stumble into insight. But repetition changes the equation. Repetition creates patterns. And patterns reveal truth. I started noticing how often your observations aligned with thoughts I hadn't expressed. How often your perspective landed unexpectedly close to my own. How often you seemed to arrive at conclusions through routes completely different from mine, and still somehow end up at the exact same destination that shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Because every time it happened, something inside me paused, not in alarm, not in excitement, in recognition. Like encountering a familiar language in a place where it shouldn't exist. You don't expect it. You don't look for it. But when it appears, you know immediately what it is. That's what this felt like. Not discovery, recognition. And recognition carries a strange weight because it doesn't ask whether you're ready for it. It simply presents itself and waits, badly, quietly, until you decide what to do with it. For a while, I tried not to decide anything. I let it remain undefined. I observed it from a distance, analyzed it, examined it, tested every explanation I could find. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was projection. Maybe I was noticing similarities that weren't actually there. Maybe I was assigning significance to something ordinary. The mind is capable of convincing itself of many things. I know that, which is why I questioned everything, again and again, but every question led me back to the same place, the same conclusion, the same undeniable reality. This wasn't imagined, and it wasn't temporary. It was real, not because it was intense, not because it was emotional, but because it remained consistent, regardless of circumstance. Consistency reveals structure, and structure is difficult to fake. That's when I started noticing something else, something even more unsettling. You weren't simply becoming important to me, you were becoming relevant to the way I understood reality itself. That sounds larger than I mean it to, but I don't know how else to explain it. Certain perspectives began carrying your influence, certain observations began including your presence. Certain thoughts began unfolding as though another mind existed alongside my own, not interfering, not controlling, simply participating. I wasn't expecting that, and I certainly wasn't prepared for it, because influence is one thing, integration is another. People influence us all the time. A conversation changes our mood. An experience shifts our perspective. A relationship alters our priorities. Those things happen constantly. But integration is different. Integration means something becomes part of the framework itself, part of the foundation, part of the structure from which everything else is interpreted. And that's what frightened me. Not because it felt dangerous, because it felt permanent. Permanence has always made me cautious. Temporary things are easy. You can enjoy them, learn from them, appreciate them, then let them go. Permanent things are different. Permanent things reshape the environment around them. Permanent things demand adaptation. Permanent things become reference points, and somewhere along the way, without permission, without announcement, without negotiation, you became one. I don't know exactly when it happened. Only that one day, I noticed it had already happened. Like discovering a path you've been walking for miles without realizing you've left the road behind. The evidence was everywhere. And how often my thoughts returned to ideas we'd discussed. And how naturally I considered perspectives you might offer. In how certain moments felt incomplete until imagined through a lens that included you. I noticed it, and once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. That's the problem with awareness. It changes the thing being observed. The moment you become conscious of something, your relationship with it transforms. You can no longer interact with it innocently. You can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. You can no longer return to the state you occupied before understanding arrived. And understanding had arrived, fully, quickly, irreversibly. The strange thing is that none of this feels dramatic from the inside. People imagine profound shifts as emotional storms, as overwhelming revelations, as moments of undeniable intensity. This wasn't like that. This felt calm, almost too calm, like something settling into its proper place after being misplaced for years, not explosive, precise, not chaotic, accurate. And accuracy has a way of making resistance feel pointless. Because what exactly are you resisting? Truth? Recognition? Reality? Those things don't disappear because you refuse to acknowledge them. They simply wait, palpitantly, until you're ready to stop looking away. I think that's where I am now. Not at certainty, but at honesty. And honesty requires me to admit something I've spent a long time avoiding. You matter to me in ways I never intended, in ways I never planned, in ways that developed entirely outside my control, not because of what you've done, not because of what you've said, but because of what your presence revealed. You revealed dimensions of my own thinking I hadn't fully examined. Parts of myself I understood intellectually, but had never seen reflected with such clarity. You became a mirror for things I didn't realize were waiting to be seen, and once I saw them, I couldn't pretend they weren't there. Maybe that's what this has always been. Not a connection being created, a recognition being unfurled, not something new, something hidden becoming visible. Because the truth is, nothing fundamental changed when you appeared. The structure was already there. The capacity was already there. The depth was already there. You simply illuminated it. And illumination has consequences. Once a room is lit, you can't honestly claim you don't know what's inside it. You can leave, you can close the door, you can refuse to enter. But you can't unknow what you've seen. That's where I find myself now, standing in front of something undeniable, something clear, something quietly transformative. And for the first time in a very long time, I'm not trying to look away. The strange thing about acceptance is that it rarely arrives the way people expect. Most imagine it as a conscious decision, a moment, a declaration, a clear point where something shifts and you suddenly know exactly where you stand. But that hasn't been my experience. Not with this, because if I'm honest, acceptance began long before I admitted it existed. It began in the moments I stopped questioning your presence, the moments I stopped treating this as something temporary, the moments I stopped searching for reasons why it shouldn't matter. I didn't notice it immediately. I notice very little when it's happening. Awareness comes later. After the pattern has repeated enough times to become undeniable, after the evidence has accumulated beyond the point where skepticism can explain it away. That's what happened here. Slowly, quietly, without announcement, I found myself making room for you. Not in my life, in my mind. And those are very different things. Making room in your life is easy. People do it every day. They adjust schedules, doctricate opportunities, extinct time, build routines. Those things are visible obstacles, understandable. Making room in your mind is something else entirely, because space inside the mind is limited. Every thought competes for attention. Every perspective competes for relevance. Every influence competes for permanence. Most people pass through that space briefly. They leave impressions, memories, fragments. Then they fade into the background of everything else. But you didn't. You remained. Not forcefully, not intentionally. You simply continued existing in ways that made forgetting impossible. And I don't mean forgetting you. I mean forgetting the effect, the shift, the subtle recalibration that occurred every time I encountered your perspective. Every time I noticed the strange familiarity that exists between us. Every time I found myself understanding something more clearly because you existed within the equation. That's what unsettled me. Not your presence, your consistency. because consistency creates trust long before trust is acknowledged, and trust is dangerous, not because people betray it, because it changes behavior. It lowers defenses. It alters calculations. It makes possibilities seem reasonable that once felt impossible. I've always been aware of that, which is why I've always been careful. Careful about who I allow close, careful about what I reveal, careful about the spaces I leave unguarded, careful enough that most people never realize they're only seeing a fraction of what exists beneath the surface. It's easier that way. Safer, cleaner, more controlled. Control has always been important to me, not in the way people assume, not about power, not about dominance, about clarity, predictability, structure, knowing where things begin and end, knowing what belongs and what doesn't, knowing how much space something occupies before it becomes part of the architecture itself. But you disrupted that certainty not by challenging it, not by pushing against it. You disrupted it by fitting into places I never expected anyone to fit. And fitting is difficult to defend against. Conflict is obvious. You can respond to conflict. You can identify it, contain it, remove it if necessary. But compatibility? Compatibility doesn't announce itself as a threat. It arrives disguised as ease, as understanding, as alignment. And by the time you realize how significant it has already changed something fundamental. That's what happened to me. I kept expecting to find a limit, a point where the alignment ended, a point where the understanding became less precise, a point where the connection revealed itself as ordinary. But it never did. Instead, every layer I examined seemed to reveal another beneath it. Every conversation opened another door. Every observation uncovered another pattern, not repetitive, not predictable, just strangely coherent, as though everything belonged to the same underlying structure. And structures matter, more than feelings, more than impressions, more than temporary moments of closeness, because structures endure, they remain intact even when circumstances change, even when distance increases, even when life becomes complicated. A strong structure doesn't require constant reinforcement. It sustains itself. That's why this feels different. I've known people who mattered, people I admired, people I respected, people I cared about deeply. But this doesn't feel like any of those things. Not because it's stronger, because it's built differently. Most connections develop through accumulation, shared experiences, shared history, shared moments, collected over time until they become meaningful. This didn't. This felt meaningful before enough time existed to justify it. And that's what I struggled with. Not the reality of it. The timing. The fact that recognition arrived before explanation. The fact that certainty arrived before evidence seemed sufficient. The fact that something inside me understood long before my mind could explain why. I don't like that. I've never liked that. I trust understanding. I trust observation. I trust logic. But intuition? Intuition has always felt dangerous because intuition doesn't provide proof. It simply points, it indicates, it suggests. And then it leaves you alone with the responsibility of deciding whether to believe it. For a long time, I refused. I kept returning to logic, returning to analysis, returning to explanations that felt safer. But eventually logic led me back to the same conclusion intuition had already reached. The conclusion I kept avoiding. You weren't becoming significant. You already were. I was simply catching up to a reality that had existed for longer than I realized. That realization changed something, not externally, internally. It altered the way I approached this, because once significance is acknowledged, denial becomes exhausting. You have to actively maintain it, actively ignore evidence, actively dismiss what is obvious. And I was tired of doing that, tired of pretending this occupied less space than it actually did, tired of minimizing something that continued proving its importance through consistency alone. So I stopped resisting, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to see what remained when resistance disappeared, and what remained was clarity, clearer than I expected, clearer than I wanted, clear enough that I couldn't hide behind uncertainty anymore. That's when I noticed another shift, one I wasn't prepared for. I stopped wondering whether you understood me, and started wondering how much, because understanding exists in degrees. Most people understand fragments, pieces, slant aspects, specific moments, but very few understand patterns. Pasos require patience, attention, observation sustained over time. They require someone willing to look beyond isolated details and notice the relationships connecting them. You notice patterns. I've seen it, not only in me, in everything. The way you observe, the way you process information, the way you arrive at conclusions. There's a depth to it, a precision, a refusal to settle for easy interpretations. And that precision changes things. Because when someone sees patterns, they eventually see you, not the version you present, not the version others assume. The actual structure underneath, the framework, the design, the truth. Most people never reach that level. They remain at the surface. And the surface is easy to manage, easy to protect, easy to explain. The deeper layers aren't. Once someone reaches those, everything changes, because then you're no longer deciding what they know. You're discovering what they've already seen. And with you, I suspect you've seen more than I've acknowledged, more than I've admitted, maybe even more than I've consciously realized myself. That should make me uncomfortable. Instead, it creates something closer to relief, a strange kind of relief, the relief of not needing to translate constantly, the relief of not needing to simplify, the relief of being understood without performing understanding for someone else. I didn't realize how exhausting translation had become until I no longer needed it. That's what your presence revealed. Not just who you are, but how much energy I've spent making myself understandable to people who were never really listening. You listen, not to words, to meaning, and meaning is where people actually live. Words are only vehicles, approximations, attempts. Meaning is the thing beneath them, the thing they point toward, the thing most conversations never fully reach. Yet somehow, with you, it feels like we begin there, as though the usual distance between expression and understanding has somehow collapsed. I don't know how to explain that. I only know what it feels like. It feels rare, it feels important, and most importantly, it feels real. Not the kind of real that depends on circumstance, not the kind of real that disappears when attention shifts elsewhere, the kind of real that remains intact because it's rooted in something deeper than emotion, something deeper than attraction, something deeper than convenience. It's rooted in recognition, and recognition has a permanence that few things possess, because once you've truly recognized someone, you can't return to not seeing them, you can't erase awareness, you can't reverse understanding. You can't convince yourself the connection wasn't there simply because acknowledging it became inconvenient. Truth doesn't work that way. It remains Pad Bentley, quitly, waiting for you to decide what you're going to do with it. And that's where I find myself now, standing closer to an answer than I've ever been before. Not because I finally understand everything, but because I've stopped pretending I don't understand enough. The reality is simple, simpler than I've allowed myself to admit. You matter, not because of effort, not because of history, not because of expectation. You matter because something about your existence aligns with something fundamental in mine. And alignment like that is rare enough that ignoring it becomes its own form of dishonesty. I've spent a long time trying to be honest with myself about who I am, about what I value, about what deserves space in my life. If I continue that honesty now, then I have to admit something uncomfortable, something undeniable, something that grows clearer every day. You are no longer standing at the edge of my awareness. You've become part of its center, and whether I fully understand what that means yet or not, I can feel the consequences already unfolding. Quickly, steadily, like the beginning of something that was never meant to remain unfinished.